A small bill, a name, and a handwritten note that froze her heart. Once the wife is removed, the merger proceeds. The man she'd loved for 8 years wasn't betraying her, he was selling her. But Damon Cross never knew the truth. The woman he intended to erase from the world wasn't the ordinary Scarlett Veil. She was Serafina Moretti, the last granddaughter of the Dark Emperor, and she had just awakened. Where are you watching from? Please like and comment your city name below so I know how far this story has progressed. Don't leave, because this is just the beginning. The suit smelled like cedar and expensive ambition, the kind of smell that clung to Damon Cross wherever he went, that absorbed into the fibers of every jacket and collar and perfectly pressed pocket square he owned. Scarlett had learned the smell years ago, the way you learn the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. Automatically, without thinking, the way the body catalogs things, the mind has already decided not to examine too closely. She was standing at the kitchen sink at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, rain hammering the window above the faucet, the city lights of Chicago smearing through the wet glass into something abstract and cold. She had the charcoal wool suit jacket in her hands because Damon had dropped it over the back of the dining chair when he came in 2 hours ago, kissed her cheek without stopping, said something about a conference call, disappeared into his office, and closed the door. He had a gala on Friday. The suit needed to go to the cleaners in the morning. She was doing what she always did, the invisible maintenance of a life that looked, from the outside, like a successful marriage. She turned out the pockets before folding it. Her fingers found the paper on the second try. It was folded twice, the crease sharp and deliberate, the kind of fold that said this document was handled carefully before being tucked away. She almost put it on the counter without opening it. She almost let it sit there, unread. Another piece of Damon's professional universe she wasn't supposed to understand or care about. Billing codes, client references, expense summaries. She'd found those before. She never read them. She opened this one. The paper was heavy stock, cream-colored, embossed at the top with a logo she didn't recognize. A stylized vault door rendered in silver ink, 2 interlocking rings beneath it. Nero Vault Holdings. The date was 3 weeks ago. The figures printed in neat columns were large enough that she had to read them twice. Wire transfers totaling just over $4 million across 6 different accounts, all labeled with alphanumeric codes, none of them pointing to anything she could identify. At the bottom of the transfer summary, a handwritten addendum in blue ballpoint. Meeting confirmed, Vivian aware, timeline attached. She found the second document underneath. A single sheet, smaller, folded inside the first. A name at the top, Vivian Laurent. Below it, a meeting summary, dates and locations, and 3 lines that referred to something called the Moretti Legacy Access Protocol, a phrase that landed in Scarlett's chest like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples spreading outward slow and cold. She was still reading when she found the line at the bottom. The handwriting was different from the first document, darker, more compressed, the letters formed by someone who held their pen with pressure. Whoever wrote it wasn't composing a note. They were issuing a directive. Once the wife is removed, the merger proceeds. The paper didn't shake. Her hands were very still. That was the first thing she noticed, that she wasn't trembling, that her body had gone somewhere quieter and more controlled than panic, somewhere older. The kitchen felt smaller. The rain sounded farther away. She read the line again. Once the wife is removed. She'd spent 20 years learning how to be unremarkable, how to occupy space without drawing attention to it, how to answer questions without revealing anything, how to smile at the right moments and forget the right things. 20 years of deliberate erasure, carefully tended the way she once watched her protectors tend the identities they manufactured for her. With patience, with precision, with the understanding that the wrong word spoken in the wrong room could end everything. She knew the language of organized crime the way some people know a language they were raised in but stopped speaking. You don't forget it. It just goes quiet in you, waiting. Removed didn't mean fired. Removed didn't mean divorced. In the lexicon she'd been raised inside, even briefly, even as a child, even through the fragmented, protected version of it she'd been allowed to witness, removed meant one specific thing. She folded both documents carefully, the way they had been folded before. She tucked them back into the jacket pocket. She finished turning out the remaining pockets. A parking receipt, 2 breath mints still in their wrapper, a business card from someone named Elliot Marsh at a downtown law firm, and she put the suit back over the chair exactly as she'd found it. Then she stood at the sink for a long time with the water running cold over her wrists, looking at nothing. Her name was Scarlett Vale. She was 31 years old. She worked the evening shift at the Harmon Historical Archive on South Michigan Avenue, cataloging and restoring damaged documents, water-damaged court records, deteriorated immigration papers, crumbling census ledgers from the early 20th century. She had a master's degree in archival science from a university that no longer knew her original name. She had a husband who came home late smelling of cedar and ambition. She had a quiet apartment on the 22nd floor with a kitchen that looked out over a city she'd chosen because it was large enough to disappear inside. She had been disappearing for 20 years. The name she was born with was Serafina Moretti. Her grandfather was Roman Moretti. Il Fantasma Imperatore, they had called him, the Ghost Emperor, a man whose empire had stretched from Chicago to Naples to Sao Paulo, who had operated for 40 years without a single photograph entering the public record, who had died, officially, in every document that acknowledged his existence, when she was 9 years old. She had not thought about Roman Moretti in years. She had worked very hard at that. Nero Vault Holdings. She turned off the faucet. She knew that name. Not consciously, not from anything she could point to, but somewhere in the architecture of her memory, in the parts she'd walled off and refused to visit, the name sat like an object in a locked room, familiar through a door she'd never opened. Her grandfather had run a dozen holding companies, legitimate facades over complex financial infrastructure, layered shells designed to make money move without anyone watching where it went. She'd been 9 when the massacre happened. She hadn't understood all of it, but she'd understood enough afterward when the men who hit her tried to explain what she needed to know to survive. She walked to the hall closet, reached past the winter coats and the folded extra linens on the upper shelf. Behind the linens, in the back corner, was a small fireproof box she'd owned for 15 years, the kind sold at hardware stores, designed for documents and backup drives. She brought it to the kitchen table and sat down. Inside the box, her real birth certificate, sealed in a plastic sleeve. A photograph, edges worn soft, of a woman she had not let herself look at in 3 years. Dark hair, strong jaw, her own eyes in an older face. Her mother, Eleni, dead at 34. A folded paper with a phone number written on it in her own handwriting from 15 years ago, the ink starting to fade. She stared at the number for a long time. She'd written it down from memory the day she turned 21, sitting in a dorm room in a city she doesn't live in anymore, just to prove she still knew it, just to prove she hadn't forgotten everything. She told herself it was documentation, the archivist impulse made personal. Preserve what exists before it deteriorates. She'd never called it. She'd never intended to call it. She was still sitting at the table when she heard Damon's office door open at 1 a.m. His footsteps crossed the hallway, paused. She imagined him seeing the kitchen light on, and then he appeared in the doorway. He looked tired. He always looked tired lately. A cultivated exhaustion that she'd attributed to the pressure of his new client relationships, the late nights, the conference calls with people in different time zones. He was 40 years old, and he looked at tonight, the angles of his face sharper than they used to be, the skin around his eyes drawn. He was wearing his dress shirt with the top 2 buttons open. "Still up?" he said. "Couldn't sleep." He went to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water. "I've got an early call. Come to bed soon." "I will." He looked at her across the kitchen. Something passed through his expression that she couldn't read, quick as a shadow, gone before she could isolate it. Then he turned and went back down the hall. She listened to the bedroom door close. She sat at the kitchen table alone and thought about the word removed, and what it cost to rebuild an identity from nothing, and whether 20 years of careful silence had made her stupid, or whether she'd simply been waiting for the wrong crisis to wake her up. She thought about Nero Vault Holdings. She thought about her grandfather's empire. She thought about the fact that Damon had been working with Vivian Laurent for 4 months, had mentioned her name in passing a dozen times. She's Victor Laurent's daughter, the casino family, a significant client. Without Scarlett registering anything except mild, shapeless discomfort, the kind she'd grown so practiced at ignoring. Victor Laurent. The discomfort became something else, something colder and more specific. She put the photograph of her mother back in the box. She put the birth certificate back. She left the paper with the phone number on the table. She did not sleep. In the morning, she made breakfast and kissed Damon before he left, and told him to have a good day, and she said it the same way she always said it, neutral, warm, automatic, and she watched his back as he crossed to the elevator, the charcoal wool jacket over his arm. He did not look back. She spent the day at the archive, and she was very good at her job, and she thought about nothing except the work in front of her, the systematic, methodical process of assessing damage and determining preservation strategy. Water damage proceeds from the outside in. Chemical degradation is more complex. It depends on what the paper was treated with, what it's been exposed to, how long. You cannot reverse deterioration, but you can halt it if you catch it early enough. She caught the edges. She steadied her hands. She made herself breathe evenly. After her shift, she walked 6 blocks north in the rain to a public library branch, chose a terminal in the back row, and began researching. NeuroVault Holdings had a website, sparse, professional, a financial consulting firm operating out of a registered address on East Wacker Drive. Listed founding date, 11 years ago. The company page listed 2 partners, both of whom had minimal digital footprints. The corporate filings, accessible through the state business registry, showed a chain of parent entities that wound through Delaware shell structures and then offshore to the Cayman Islands and then went dark. She'd seen that structure before, not directly, not in any document she'd handled, but the shape of it, the deliberate complexity, the way each layer existed only to make the next layer harder to see, was recognizable in the same way the phrase NeuroVault was recognizable, the same way the word removed had landed with such specific weight. She searched Vivian Laurent next. Vivian Laurent was 36, the only child of Victor Laurent, founder and majority shareholder of Laurent Global Entertainment, one of the largest casino and hospitality conglomerates in North America. Victor was 68, semi-retired, described in every article as a visionary, a philanthropist, a self-made billionaire who'd built his empire from a single riverboat casino in Louisiana in the early 1990s. He gave to universities. He sat on arts boards. He had a lake house in Wisconsin and a winter home in Scottsdale. Scarlett had been married to Damon Cross for 8 years. Victor Laurent had been mentioned in their lives exactly once, briefly, as background to a client relationship that was supposed to be about a corporate merger. She searched. Laurent family Chicago criminal connections. The results were thin and old, a mid-2000s investigative piece in an alternative weekly that had since folded, its archived pages half-corrupted, referencing unproven allegations of money laundering through Laurent casino properties. A court filing from 2009 that appeared to have been settled confidentially. A single paragraph in a longer organized crime retrospective from 2011 that referenced ancillary figures adjacent to the dismantled Moretti network and mentioned Victor Laurent's name in a subordinate clause that stopped just short of direct accusation. She read that paragraph 4 times. Then she closed the browser, cleared the history, and walked back out into the rain. She spent 4 more days doing nothing visible. She cooked dinner. She went to work. She asked Damon about his week and listened to the answers with her face arranged in its customary expression of attentive, undemanding interest. She was good at this. She'd spent her entire adult life being good at this. She also spent those 4 days dismantling the story she'd been told, not the story about who she was. She'd always known that one was constructed. She meant the story about her marriage, the story she'd been living inside, which she'd believed in the way you believe in the architecture of a house you've lived in long enough, not actively, not with examination, but with the passive faith of daily inhabitation. 8 years. She'd chosen Damon because he was steady and ambitious, and he hadn't asked too many questions about her past, and she'd told herself that was compatibility, told herself it was maturity, told herself the numbness she sometimes felt at the center of the relationship was just the natural settling that happened over time. Now she turned the story over and looked at its underside. He had never pushed too hard about her family, but he had asked in the early years. Specific questions that she'd deflected. Questions about her parents, her childhood city, her extended family. She'd given him the cover story. Orphaned young, raised by a distant aunt who'd since died, no other relatives. He'd accepted it without much pressure. She'd been grateful for that. Now she thought about what it meant that he hadn't pushed. She accessed the joint bank accounts on the fifth night after Damon fell asleep, using his laptop while he was in the shower and finishing on her phone before he came out. The accounts were exactly what they'd always appeared to be. His salary depositing cleanly, household expenses, her small archival income in its separate account. Nothing unusual. She went deeper. It took her 3 evenings, using research skills developed over a decade of professional archival work, combined with the particular instinct for document trails she'd inherited from people who had survived by understanding exactly that everything leaves traces, that the past doesn't vanish, it only gets buried. She found a business account she hadn't known existed, attached to an LLC, registered under a slight variation of Damon's middle name. She found wire transfers. She found correspondence references and forwarded email chains she'd accessed using a password he'd never thought to change, to something called the Moretti Legacy Trust. The trust had been established 11 years ago, the year they met. She sat on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. with her back against the tub and her phone in her lap, and she let herself feel it, all of it. The specific quality of having the ground pulled out from under you in slow motion, the structural betrayal of it, the way it rewrote everything backward. She felt it for approximately 12 minutes. Then she folded it away and stood up. Because Serafina Moretti had not survived a massacre at 9 years old by falling apart. She called the number on a Thursday afternoon from a payphone on the Blue Line platform at O'Hare, using a transit card she'd paid for in cash. The phone rang 4 times. She was prepared for no answer, for a disconnected line, for anything except what happened, which was that someone picked up on the 4th ring and said, in a voice she hadn't heard in over 20 years but recognized the way you recognize the smell of a place you grew up in, immediately, viscerally, with something that lived below memory. Serafina. Not a question. Luca, she said. Silence on the line. Then, how long have you known? 5 days. Another pause. She heard him breathe, a controlled, careful breath, the sound of someone running threat assessment in real time. Where are you? Transit station, payphone. I have 2 minutes. Are you safe right now, in this moment? Yes. Has anyone made contact? Anyone approach you, follow you? Anything unusual? No, nothing. All right. His voice had a quality she remembered from childhood. Not warmth, exactly, but steadiness, the kind that came from a man who'd spent his life in rooms where steadiness was a survival trait. Don't go home tonight. Damon has a dinner. He won't be back until... Don't go home, Luca said again quietly, and the repetition carried enough weight that she stopped talking. I'm sending someone to the address you have for the archive. Midnight. Wait inside. Luca, I need to know about Victor Laurent and my... Not on this line. The calm in his voice was a door closing. Midnight. Wait for the knock. The call ended. She stood in the noise of the station with the dead receiver in her hand and the train arriving on the opposite platform and the particular sensation she recognized from an afternoon 22 years ago when she'd been 9 years old and a man she'd never seen before had taken her by the hand in the back of a burning house and walked her out through a side door into a different life entirely. The sensation of a threshold. The exact moment before everything changes. She put the receiver down. She went to work. The knock came at 12:14. 3 short, a pause. 2. A signal from a language she'd been taught and never used, that she'd carried in her body for 23 years like a key to a door she'd never expected to open. She opened the archive's rear service entrance to find a woman she didn't recognize. Mid-40s, compact, dark coat, the particular watchfulness in her eyes that belonged to a specific kind of professional. Behind her, double-parked in the loading alley, 2 black SUVs with their lights off. Ms. Vale, the woman said. I'm Cass. Luca sent me. We have about 4 minutes before the alley's on a traffic camera cycle. Do you have what you need? Scarlett had been ready for 2 hours. Small bag, the fireproof box. Nothing else. Yes, she said. Then we're going. She stepped out into the cold alley. The rear door of the archive swung shut behind her, its automatic lock engaging with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She crossed to the vehicle without looking back. Inside the SUV, moving north through the wet Chicago streets, Cass handed her a phone. Clean, no contacts, and said, "Luca will brief you en route. There's something you need to know before you hear it from him." Scarlett looked at her. "The Laurent family's been active," Cass said. "There was a contract put out, not recent, old, 11 years old." She paused. "They've known who you are for a long time." The city slid past the tinted windows, rain on a glass, the lights of Chicago smearing like something dissolving. "And Damon?" Scarlett said. Cass was quiet for just a beat too long. "He wasn't recruited," she said finally. "He applied." The word sat between them in the dark vehicle like a stone. Applied. Scarlett turned back to the window. She didn't say anything. She watched the city she'd hidden inside for 8 years move past her in the dark, and she thought about the word removed, and she thought about the word applied, and she understood, with the cold precision of a woman who had spent her professional life assessing irreversible damage, that some deterioration can be halted if you catch it early enough. And some of it you can use. The SUV crossed onto the expressway. Chicago fell away behind her. Somewhere ahead, something that had been sleeping for 20 years was pulling itself upright. The estate outside Lake Como didn't look like what it was. That was the point. From the road, a narrow, unmarked lane cutting through forested hillside 20 kilometers north of the city, it appeared to be a working agricultural property. Olive trees in terraced rows climbing the slope, a stone farmhouse with shuttered windows, outbuildings that looked like equipment storage. Nothing about it suggested the kind of money that had kept it invisible for 30 years. Scarlett learned that in the first hour. She learned it because Luca DeSantis told her directly, with the same quality of blunt delivery she was beginning to associate with him. A man who communicated facts the way other men drove on highways, at a constant, controlled speed, no unnecessary stops. "The property belongs to a company registered in Zurich," he said. "The company belongs to a family trust. The family trust was established by your grandfather in 1987 and has been administered by the network ever since. It has never been connected to the Moretti name in any public record." They were sitting in the main room of the farmhouse, which was nothing like a farmhouse on the inside. The stone walls were original, the floors were original, but the interior had been quietly renovated into something functional and serious. A long table, encrypted communications equipment, monitors, a kitchen that looked like it fed a staff of 12. The windows were triple-paned and the shutters were reinforced steel finished to look like wood from the outside. Luca was 61 years old. He was shorter than she'd remembered, or maybe she'd remembered wrong. She'd been 9 the last time she saw him, which meant all her memories of him were from the perspective of a child who had since grown into a woman with different scale. He was compact, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had never been particularly expressive and had grown less so with age. He wore a dark sweater and no jewelry. His hands, resting on the table, were still. Across the table from him, Cass was making notes on a tablet. 2 other people occupied chairs near the communications equipment, a young man Scarlett hadn't been introduced to yet, and a woman in her 50s with close-cropped hair and reading glasses who Luca had referred to only as our legal infrastructure. Scarlett had slept 4 hours in the vehicle. She'd changed into clean clothes in a bathroom at the Milan safe house, where they'd stopped for 2 hours. She was operating on adrenaline and a particular kind of cold clarity that she'd discovered in herself over the past week and was still measuring the edges of. "The Moretti Legacy Trust," she said. "How does Damon know about it?" Luca looked at her steadily. "He was told. By Victor Laurent. By a representative working for Victor Laurent, a financial intermediary. The approach was made about a year before you met Damon." He paused, letting that land. "He was given a partial account of your identity. Not everything. Laurent didn't trust Damon with the full picture. He was told you were the surviving heir to a dormant financial network with offshore accounts accessible only through biometric verification tied to Moretti Bloodline." "A key," Scarlett said. "That was their term, yes." She looked at the table surface for a moment, polished stone, cold, faintly reflective. She could see the distorted shape of her own hands in it. "He married me for blood access. He married you for the promise of what your blood could unlock, The accounts have been dormant since your grandfather disappeared. The biometric locks, fingerprint, retinal, a proprietary DNA verification system that was ahead of its time in 1994, mean the assets can't be accessed or liquidated without your physical presence and cooperation. Luca's voice didn't change register. You represent approximately $2.3 billion in frozen offshore assets, Serafina. The majority of it has compounded interest for 20-plus years. The number sat in the room. "Stop calling me Serafina," she said. He looked at her. "I'll answer to it eventually. Give me time." She pushed back from the table and stood up, needing the movement, needing to reorganize the space around her. "Why didn't you come for me earlier? If you've known where I was—" "We've known where you were since you enrolled in graduate school," Luca said. "We've watched you continuously. The decision your grandfather's network made when you were 9 was that you were safer outside the network than inside it. The world believing the Moretti bloodline extinct was your best protection." He paused. "I disagreed with that decision. For the record." "Who made it?" "A council. Men your grandfather trusted. Some of them are dead now. Some are in this building." She turned and looked at the woman with reading glasses, who met her gaze without expression. "We brought you out when we did," Luca continued, "because the Laurent timeline accelerated. The merger Damon referenced is not a corporate merger. It's a consolidation. Laurent is trying to absorb the remaining infrastructure of half a dozen criminal networks that lost leadership over the past decade. To complete it, he needs the Moretti assets unlocked. Without them, 3 of the 6 networks refuse the arrangement. The assets are leverage and capital simultaneously. And the contract on me? 11 years old, standing, but dormant. Laurent wanted you alive and cooperative, not dead. That changed approximately 60 days ago." Luca's hands moved slightly on the table, a small adjustment. "We believe the change is connected to the merger timeline. If the merger closes without the Moretti assets, it closes on weaker terms. If you're dead, the assets remain frozen in perpetuity, inaccessible, but also neutralized. Laurent appears to have concluded that neutralized is acceptable at this stage." Scarlett absorbed this. She walked to the window, shuddered, no view, and stood with her back to the room for a moment. "What about my grandfather's records?" she said. "The original documentation of what Laurent did to this family. Does it exist?" The pause that followed was one beat too long. "Luca, there are records," he said. "Your grandfather was meticulous. Before he disappeared, he established multiple redundant archives of the network's operational history. Transactions, communications, documented evidence of the Laurent family's role in the 1994 federal operation that dismantled the Moretti organization and killed your mother and 17 other people." Another pause. "Those archives are stored in several locations. One of them is a vault, a physical vault." She turned around. "Where?" "Chicago." Something moved in her chest. "Nero Vault Holdings." Luca's expression shifted, barely. The closest thing to surprise she'd seen from him. "You found the name." "It was on the receipt." He was quiet for a moment. "The vault facility operates under the Nero Holdings umbrella. The original structure was established by your grandfather as a dead drop repository, a location where evidence could survive even if the network didn't. It's been maintained by 2 of our people for 30 years, continuously, under successive corporate covers." He looked at her. "Victor Laurent has been trying to locate it for 20 years. He has not succeeded. Because he doesn't know the access protocol." "Because the access protocol is biometric," Luca said. "Moretti bloodline. The same as the offshore accounts." She stood in the middle of the room and understood the full architecture of it for the first time. The way it fit together, the elegance of a trap her grandfather had built 30 years ago, and then arranged for her to inherit without ever telling her. A dead man's hand, laid out across decades, waiting for the right moment. "He knew," she said. "Roman knew, when he built all of this, that it might come down to me. He believed," Luca said carefully, "that if everything else failed, the bloodline would be enough. That whoever carried it would be enough." He met her eyes. He was not wrong about that. He was simply wrong about the timeline. She sat back down. "Then we start," she said. "Tell me everything I should have been told 20 years ago." They told her in stages over 4 days because the full account of what the Moretti network was, what it had done, what it had built, how it had operated, was not a briefing. It was an education. And education, when it runs directly counter to the identity you've spent your adult life constructing, has a physical dimension. It sits in the body the way old injuries do. It aches. She learned about her grandfather's financial architecture, the layered offshore structures, the legitimate business fronts, the methods by which Roman Moretti had built a criminal empire that crossed 3 continents and survived 4 decades of federal pressure by being fundamentally harder to see than the organizations that came before it. Roman had not been a violent man by preference. He'd been a structural one. He understood that money, moved correctly, was harder to prosecute than bodies, and he'd built accordingly. She learned about her mother. Eleni Moretti had been 34 when she died in the Chicago house fire that was not a fire. She had known about the threat. She had chosen to stay rather than run because she was trying to recover the original documentation from the home archive before it could be destroyed. She had not succeeded. Scarlett sat in the stone farmhouse kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her and listened to Luca describe the night her mother died with the flat, precise delivery of a man who had been processing that grief for 22 years and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it. She felt the information enter her and settle into the places where the gaps had always been, and she did not cry, and she did not speak, and Luca, to his credit, did not try to fill the silence. After a while, she said, "She could have left." "Yes." "She stayed for the documents." "Yes." "Did she know they were in the vault too? The same records?" Luca was quiet for a moment. "We believe she may not have known the vault existed. Your grandfather was careful about compartmentalization. He may not have told her." She thought about that. About a woman dying in a burning house for documents that were already safe somewhere else. About a grandfather who had loved his daughter but not trusted her with everything. About the particular cruelty of that kind of protection. She drank the cold coffee. "Okay," she said. "What's next?" What was next was Cass. Cass, full name Cassandra Vale, former intelligence, current network, ran the operational briefings with a different quality than Luca's. Where Luca was still and deliberate, Cass was kinetic, moving around the room while she talked, switching between displays and physical documents with the energy of someone whose brain processed information faster than most rooms could keep up with. "You have 3 primary vulnerabilities right now," Cass said on the second morning. 1. Your legal identity as Scarlett Vale is compromised. Laurent's people have been monitoring the alias for at least 3 years. 2. Damon Cross knows enough about the vault to be dangerous, but not enough to be useful, which means Laurent's going to squeeze him for what he does know the moment the situation destabilizes, and Damon's going to give it up. She clicked to the next display, Tama. A photograph. Grainy, taken through a long lens. 3. Someone inside our network has been feeding the Lawrence positional data. Not much, not specific enough to be a direct threat, but consistent over time. We have a problem. Scarlett studied the photograph. It was a man she didn't recognize, thick-necked, standing outside a building that looked like a Chicago parking structure. Who is he? We don't know yet. Cass's jaw tightened slightly. And that's the problem. We have a shape. We know the leak exists. We know roughly what's been passed. But we don't have the source. She turned from the display. Which means you can't trust everyone in this building. Can I trust you? Cass looked at her without blinking. You don't know me well enough to answer that yourself. That's fair. What I can tell you is that I've been with this network for 12 years, and I have very specific reasons for wanting Victor Laurent in a federal holding facility that have nothing to do with you personally. A beat. But I'd say that either way, wouldn't I? Yes, Scarlett said. You would. Cass almost smiled. Good. You're thinking straight. They worked the vulnerabilities systematically. The Scarlett Vale identity would need to be maintained publicly for the short term. An abrupt disappearance would trigger alarms with Laurent's surveillance. Someone from the network was maintaining a ghost version of her daily routine in Chicago. The archive, the apartment, careful digital traces. It bought time. The internal leak was a harder problem. How many people knew we were pulling her out of Chicago? Scarlett asked Luca that evening after Cass had left. 7. And how many are in this building? 5 of the 7. She looked at him. That's not a comfortable number. No. He was pouring water, the small domestic gesture strangely incongruous with everything around it. It is not. Who are the other 2? One is in Milan, one is dead. He died 6 weeks ago of what appeared to be natural causes, which I have doubted since the morning I heard about it. He set the glass down. I have my suspicions about the source. I am not sharing them yet because suspicion without evidence is how good people get destroyed. She thought about her grandfather, about a man who'd built a criminal empire on the principle that evidence was everything, that what you could prove was the only currency that survived. Then we get evidence, she said. Yes. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Lucas said, we educate you. But he meant it literally. The next week was a different kind of brutal than she'd expected. She'd braced for the emotional content, the history of her family, the details of her grandfather's empire, the accounting of what had been done and by whom. That had been hard, yes. It had rearranged things inside her, but she'd been an archivist for a decade. She knew how to hold damaged material carefully. What she hadn't expected was the rest of it. The financial architecture she needed to understand to control the Moretti assets was not simple. Luca brought in 2 specialists, quiet, efficient people who spent 2 days walking her through offshore trust law, biometric access protocols, the legal mechanisms by which dormant assets could be claimed and legitimized. She asked precise questions. She retained everything. The archivist's mind, it turned out, was exactly the right instrument for it. What she also hadn't expected was Luca insisting on the other kind of preparation. I'm not training to be a soldier, she said. On the morning he showed her the room behind the equipment storage building. Stripped concrete, mats, the basic functional vocabulary of a space designed to teach people how to not be helpless. No, Luca agreed. But you need to not be helpless. He said it without apology. The situation you're returning to will put you in rooms with dangerous people. Some of them will try to physically control you. I'm not asking you to fight a trained operative. I'm asking you to be able to create enough distance and time to let someone else handle it. She stood in the concrete room and breathed. My grandfather, she said. What about him? Did he do this? Train? Your grandfather, Luca said, was the most dangerous man I ever knew, and he never threw a punch in anger in 40 years of operation. A pause. He used other people for that. He didn't have other people. You do. She turned to face him. Then teach me. He taught her. Over 6 days, a woman named Dara, small, efficient, with the quality of stillness that preceded violence, worked with her for 2 hours each morning on the practical vocabulary of physical self-preservation. Not fighting. Exactly what Luca had said, space and time. How to break a hold, how to move through a room, how to read where the threat was before it became the threat. Scarlett was not naturally gifted at it. She was determined, which Dara told her was worth more. In the evenings, she studied the financial records. In the afternoon, she worked through the network's intelligence files on the Laurent family, with Cass, Victor's history, his methods, his known associates, the structure of Laurent Global Entertainment, and where its criminal infrastructure intersected with its legitimate face. And on the 7th night, Cass found the leak. She came to Scarlett's room at 11:15, knocked twice, and when Scarlett opened the door, she said quietly, "Get dressed. Bring nothing." They walked to a room at the back of the property that Scarlett hadn't been inside, a former wine cellar, converted, with a single lamp and 2 chairs, and a third person already inside. The third person was the young man from the communications equipment on the first day. His name was Theo. He was 27, Italian-Swiss, had been with the network for 4 years. He was sitting very straight in the chair, and his face was the face of someone who has made a calculation and is waiting to find out if it was the right one. Luca was standing against the wall. "Tell her what you told me," Cass said. Theo looked at Scarlett. "The leak isn't one of the 7, he said. "It's older than that. There's a protocol in the network's communication system, legacy code, built in during a restructuring 8 years ago, that creates a passive copy of certain flagged message types. Financial authorization requests, biometric access flags, Air status communications. The copies route to a secondary server. He paused. The secondary server is registered to a holding company in Malta. Laurent, Scarlett said. Laurent's people, yes. But the routing was installed by someone inside this network 8 years ago, before I was here, before Cass was here. He glanced at Luca. Before you came back from Milan, Luca. Silence in the cellar. Luca said nothing. That leaves 3 people who were operational 8 years ago and are still active, Cass said, not looking at Luca, her eyes on the wall. Myself excluded since I wasn't here. You said you've been with the network 12 years, Scarlett said to Cass. I have, but I wasn't brought into this specific cell until 6 years ago. Cass's voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the control is working very hard. Which means I'm not on the list. Scarlett looked at Luca. He was looking at the floor. His hands were still. Then he raised his head. The 3 people, he said. I know who it is. Then say it, Cass said. A beat. Marco Fieri. He runs our legal structure in Zurich. He had access to the communication systems during the restructuring, and he has a daughter in a Laurent-connected private hospital in Lugano, has had for 7 years. A daughter with a condition that requires ongoing expensive treatment. He stopped. I've known about the daughter for 2 years. I told myself it wasn't relevant. The room was quiet enough that Scarlett could hear the ventilation. You knew for 2 years, she said. I suspected. You suspected for 2 years that someone inside this network was feeding Laurent's people our positions, feeding them my position. Her voice was level. She was very proud of how level it was. I had no proof. I was in Chicago for 8 years, and you had a suspicion. If I'd moved on suspicion and been wrong, I would have destroyed a loyal man's life. Luca's voice didn't rise, but something behind it shifted. This work requires evidence, Serafina. You know that. You said it yourself 3 days ago. I said it about an unknown. You knew this man. I knew him for 30 years, yes. He met her eyes. And I was wrong to wait. I'm telling you that. I am not asking you to forgive it. She held his gaze for a long moment. What's he past them? She said. The extraction from Chicago, Theo said. The destination was flagged but not specific. They know she's in Europe. They don't have this location. Yet. Yet, Scarlett repeated. The flag would have triggered a query in the system. Marco will know the question was asked, which means he'll know, or suspect, that we're looking. How long before he alerts Laurent? Theo's expression answered before his words did. If he hasn't already, hours. Maybe less. Scarlett looked at Luca. He straightened from the wall. The decision moved across his face and settled. Cass, get Dara and Renault. We leave the estate in 90 minutes. And Marco? Cass said. A pause. I'll handle Marco, Luca said. Cass nodded and left. Theo followed her. Scarlett stayed. You said you disagreed, she said to Luca. With the decision to keep me outside the network. Yes. Why? He picked up his jacket from the chair back. Because the network is the only protection worth having, and protection at a distance eventually fails. He looked at her. I was right about that. You were also the person who kept me outside it for 20 years, she said, while you sat on information that put me in danger. He didn't flinch. Yes. So when you tell me you're handling Marco, I'm going to confront him and give him one opportunity to tell me everything he passed before we neutralize the channel and move. He held her gaze. I'm not going to hurt him. He has a sick daughter and 30 years of loyalty before this. But that does not mean I'm going to let it continue. She studied him. She thought about the 9-year-old girl who'd trusted this man to lead her out of a burning house, and the 31-year-old woman who was standing in a cellar in Italy having to decide how much of that trust still applied. 90 minutes, she said. She walked out. They moved to a secondary location, a property outside Zurich, smaller, a safe house in the most literal sense, anonymous in a neighborhood of anonymous buildings. The estate on Lake Como went dark behind them. Marco Fieri, confronted by Luca in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes, had confirmed 2 transfers of intelligence, the extraction flag, and a 3-week-old communication identifying Scarlett as the surviving Moretti heir. He had been passing information to Laurent's intermediaries for 6 years. He had done it for the daughter. He had done it under the assurance, Laurent's assurance, the assurance of a man who had orchestrated a massacre and called it business, that the information would never be used against the heir directly. He believed that? Scarlett asked when Luca told her. He needed to believe it. She let that sit. The Zurich house was smaller, colder, the kind of functional that didn't pretend to be anything else. She sat in a chair by a window at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, going through the financial files on a tablet, working the numbers the way she worked damaged documents at the archive, methodically, from the outside in, looking for the places where the structure had held and the places where it hadn't. $2.3 billion, frozen for 22 years. A vault in Chicago containing 30 years of evidence. A man in a Chicago apartment who had been using her identity to access financial structures he didn't fully understand, connected to a family that had killed her mother and spent 20 years hunting her, planning her removal with the same casual corporate efficiency he'd applied to every other deal he'd ever made. She thought about the morning after she'd found the receipt, making breakfast, kissing his cheek, saying, "Have a good day." She thought about the 11 years. She thought about the word applied. The tablet in her hand showed a financial summary, the projected current value of the Moretti assets, the access timeline once she initiated biometric verification, the restructuring options available under international trust law. In the right column, a separate figure, the estimated documentary value of the Nero Vault Holdings archive. Evidence sufficient, according to the legal summary beside it, to support federal prosecution of Victor Laurent on racketeering, conspiracy, and accessory charges in multiple jurisdictions. She had been a key all along. She'd just never known what door she opened. She set the tablet down. She looked at the dark window. In the glass, faintly, she could see her own reflection. Tired, sharper than she remembered looking, something in the set of her jaw that she recognized from the photograph of her mother and had spent 20 years not recognizing in herself. Her phone lit up on the chair arm. A message from Cass. Laurent's people just pulled Damon Cross's financial records through a law enforcement contact. They're squeezing him. A pause, then a second message. He has 48 hours before they decide he's used up. Scarlett read the messages twice. Damon being squeezed. Damon with enough information to point Laurent toward the vault even without the access codes. Damon, who had applied for the job of erasing her. She thought about going back to Chicago. She thought about what it would mean to walk back into the city as herself, as Serafina Moretti, as the woman they'd spent 20 years hunting. She thought about the vault and the evidence inside it and the frozen assets and the federal apparatus that would need to be engaged at exactly the right moment or the whole architecture collapsed. She thought about Victor Laurent's face, which she'd never seen, and the way her grandfather's men had described him. Careful, patient, a man who built his empire by waiting for the right moment and then hitting precisely. She'd been trained, this past week and her whole life before it, in exactly that skill. She picked up the phone and typed back to Cass. "How fast can we get back to Chicago?" The response came in under a minute. 40 hours if we move now. She stood up from the chair. She crossed to Luca's door and knocked. He answered in 12 seconds, fully dressed, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "I need to go back," she said. "I know. If Laurent gets what he needs from Damon, I know." He stepped back from the door. "Come in. We have planning to do." She stepped inside and the door closed behind her, and somewhere in the cold Zurich dark she could feel it. The thing she'd been holding back all week. The thing that wasn't grief and wasn't rage and wasn't exactly courage either, but was something that lived in the overlap of all three. Something that had her grandfather's fingerprints on it and her mother's eyes. She spread the Chicago maps across the table. She did not think about mercy. That was the last thought she'd had in Zurich, standing over the Chicago maps with Luca's lamp throwing hard shadows across the table, the thought she'd stopped herself from finishing. She did not think about mercy. Not for Damon, not for Victor Laurent, not even for Marco Fieri sitting somewhere in Lugano telling himself he'd done what any father would do. She had spent a week being educated, and the most complete lesson had nothing to do with financial architecture or biometric access protocols. The most complete lesson was this: the people who had arranged her removal had not spent one moment thinking about mercy. Not when they killed her mother, not when they planted Damon in her path, not in 11 years of waiting for the right moment to take what they wanted from her blood and put the rest in the ground. Mercy was a door. You only got to close it once. She closed it somewhere over the Atlantic, somewhere in the pressurized dark of the private aircraft Luca had arranged, while Cass slept in the seat across the aisle and the financial documents glowed blue-white on the tablet in her lap. She closed it quietly, without ceremony, the way she closed the archive at the end of a long shift. Turned the lock. Pocketed the key. Moved on. They landed at a private airfield outside Gary, Indiana at 4:17 in the morning. 2 vehicles. No markings. 40 minutes into Chicago through pre-dawn emptiness, the city sitting dark and flat under a low-cloud ceiling. The skyline's lights blurred with the particular quality of late winter, everything waiting for something. The safe house was a 3-story brownstone in Pilsen, owned through the network, the kind of property that looked like a rental in an improving neighborhood, and had been quietly outfitted for operational use over the past 2 years. Cass had been coordinating with 2 people already on the ground: a man named Renault, former intelligence, and a woman named Sue who handled surveillance and had been monitoring Damon's movements for the past 10 days. Sue met them in the ground floor kitchen with a tablet already open and the particular tight expression of someone managing too many variables and not enough time. "Laurent's people moved faster than we expected," she said, before Scarlett had taken her coat off. "Damon Cross was contacted 40 hours ago. Not squeezed, contacted. Different approach. They offered him protection and a financial package in exchange for his voluntary cooperation." She turned the tablet to show a photograph taken through a long lens. Damon in a restaurant Scarlett recognized, a place he'd taken her for their 4th anniversary, sitting across from a man in a dark suit she didn't know. He took the meeting. Scarlett looked at the photograph. Damon's posture, forward, engaged, his hands moving the way they moved when he was negotiating. She knew that posture. She'd watched it across dinner tables for 8 years. "How much did he give them?" Luca said. "We don't know yet. Our audio coverage of the meeting was partial. We got the first 20 minutes, and then they moved to a private room." Sue pulled up a second display. "What we do know is that 12 hours after the meeting, a legal filing appeared in the Cook County system under an LLC associated with Damon's practice. A claim of spousal interest in dormant financial assets." Silence. "He filed a legal claim," Scarlett said. "A preemptive one. The filing doesn't name the specific assets. It can't because he doesn't have the account details. But it establishes a legal marker under marital property law that could complicate a direct claim by the biological heir if the assets surface in a U.S.-connected jurisdiction." Sue's voice was careful and flat. "It's not a fatal move. Our legal people can counter it. But it suggests Laurent's approach has shifted. They're not just trying to squeeze him for intelligence anymore. They're building a parallel legal architecture to challenge any claim you make." "They're preparing for me to surface," Scarlett said. "Yes." She set her coat over the back of a chair. She looked at the photograph again. Damon in the restaurant, negotiating the terms of her erasure with the same professional fluency he'd applied to every deal she'd ever watched him close. And she felt something very specific and very controlled move through her and settle. "What's our timeline to the vault?" she said. "That," Cass said, coming in from the hallway with her own tablet, "is the problem we need to talk about." The problem was this: Nero Vault Holdings, the legitimate corporate face of the archive her grandfather had built, was located in a building on East Walker Drive. The vault itself, the physical repository, was 3 levels below the registered office, in a sub-basement that predated the current building's construction, accessible through a maintenance corridor that the building's current management believed serviced historical utility infrastructure. 2 people from the network had maintained the facility for 30 years. One of them was a 73-year-old man named Bernard, who had worked as a building maintenance supervisor since 1989. The other was Bernard's daughter, who had taken over half his duties when his health declined. Bernard had stopped answering his check-in protocol 6 days ago. Missing? Scarlett said. We don't know. Cass pulled up a building access log on her screen. His badge was used to enter the building 4 days ago at 6 in the morning. It wasn't used to exit. The building's internal cameras show him entering the maintenance corridor at 6:12. After that, nothing. Laurent's people. Possibly. Or he's hiding and went dark voluntarily because he made them. We can't determine which without going in. She paused. His daughter Petra made contact with our network 2 days ago through the emergency protocol. She's confirmed she's not been inside the building since Bernard disappeared. She won't go back in without a direct order from network leadership. Another pause. From you. Scarlett absorbed this. Does she know who I am? Bernard told her there was an heir. He didn't tell her your name or what you looked like. He told her that if anything happened to him, she was to wait for a woman who would identify herself with the vault's secondary access code. Which I have. Which you have. Scarlett looked at Luca. He was standing against the kitchen wall in the same posture she'd been cataloging all week. Contained, assessing, the look of a man running probabilities. The risk, he said, is that if Laurent's people have Bernard, they have whatever he knows about the vault's location and access. Bernard knew the physical location and the maintenance corridor approach. He did not know the biometric protocol or the secondary access code. The vault cannot be opened without both. So they need me, Scarlett said, or they need enough time to attempt a forced entry, which the vault is designed to resist for approximately 72 hours against professional-grade tools. He looked at her. We don't know when the clock started. She did the calculation. 4 days since Bernard's last contact. 72 hours of vault resistance. If they'd gotten to Bernard on the day he disappeared and started immediately, the clock may already be done, she said. It may be. Then we move tonight. We move tonight, Luca agreed, but carefully. If Laurent's people are already inside the maintenance corridor, walking in is walking into a holding position. Renaud, who'd been quiet in the doorway, said, We have 2 people who can clear the corridor approach. Give me 4 hours to position them. Luca nodded. 4 hours. Then we go. The 4 hours were the longest she'd spent since the night she found the receipt. Scarlett used them the way she used everything now. Methodically, practically, without sentiment. She reviewed the vault access protocols with Cass until she had them precise. She changed into clothes suited for a basement, dark, close-fitting, flat boots. She ate because Sue put food in front of her, and she'd learned enough in the past 2 weeks to understand that the body's resource management mattered. She did not sleep. At 9:47 in the evening, she sat in the back of Renaud's vehicle as it moved through downtown Chicago. The city lit up and indifferent around her, people on the sidewalks outside restaurants and bars. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday night in a city that had no idea what was moving through it. She looked out the window and felt the strange, doubled quality of it. The city she'd lived in for 8 years, the streets she knew, and underneath that familiarity, something colder and more structural, the city as her grandfather had known it, a geography of leverage and exposure, every building a potential asset or liability, every street a line of sight or an escape route. Renaud's voice from the front. Corridor approach is clear. Both our people are in position. Bernard? Luca said. No sign. His badge hasn't been used again. No bodies, no signs of a struggle in the accessible areas. A pause. The maintenance door to the sub-basement shows fresh tool marks on the frame. Someone tried to open it and couldn't. When? The scratch patterns look recent, days, not weeks. Luca looked at her. She nodded. They went in through a service entrance on the building's north side. Renaud's key card, a copy of Bernard's, cloned 2 years ago as a contingency, sliding the reader green at 11:14. The lobby was empty, the building's overnight security stationed at the main entrance 40 meters away. They moved through a service corridor to the maintenance stairs, down 2 levels, through a door that opened to the smell of old stone and machine oil and the deep cold that accumulated below the city's surface. The maintenance corridor was narrow and long, fluorescent strips along the ceiling throwing flat white light. Renaud went first, then Scarlett, then Luca, then Cass with her hand near her jacket. The sub-basement door was steel, painted utility gray, with 2 standard locks and a card reader that was not standard at all. Custom hardware, installed in 1994 and updated twice since. The kind that accepted a card and then waited for the biometric sequence. Scratch marks on the doorframe, fresh, exactly as Renault had said. Someone had worked on the lock mechanism and gotten nowhere. She ran the secondary access code first. 12 digits, keyed into the panel from memory. The reader processed. A second panel slid open beside the door. A biometric unit, scanner, and small screen. She placed her right hand flat on the scanner. The screen showed a processing bar. 5 seconds. 10. Then a soft tone and the deadbolts withdrew in sequence. 4 of them, the sound heavy and deliberate in the corridor's quiet. The door opened. Inside was darkness, and then the automatic lighting came on. Strips of LED along the floor edge, casting the room in a low, even glow. The vault was larger than she'd imagined from the descriptions. A rectangular space maybe 12 meters by 8, the walls lined with fireproof filing cabinets and sealed archive boxes. A central table, a server unit in the far corner that was still running, its status lights blinking patient and green. 30 years of her grandfather's documentation, waiting. She stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, letting it be real. Then she crossed to the server unit and Cass came in behind her, and they started working. The archive was organized with the same structural precision that had characterized everything she'd learned about Roman Moretti. The server held digitized copies, the physical documents were in the cabinets, organized chronologically and by subject. Cass pulled up the server index while Scarlett began moving through the cabinet labels, and within 20 minutes they had what they needed confirmed. Records of the Laurent family's coordination with federal officials in the 1994 operation, transaction records showing payments from Victor Laurent to the Federal Task Force supervisor, communication logs between Laurent and the men who'd been tasked with executing the Moretti leadership. The night her mother died, in a document labeled with a date she'd carried in her body for 22 years. She opened the cabinet, pulled the file, set it on the table, and opened it without allowing herself to hesitate. Her mother's name was in a surveillance authorization, cross-referenced to an elimination order. The order bore a signature she didn't recognize and a reference number that matched the Laurent financial records in the adjacent file. Eleni Moretti. Threat classification, secondary. Authorized, yes. Secondary. Her mother had been secondary. She was standing in a basement at midnight holding a document that described her mother's murder in the language of bureaucratic authorization, and her mother had been a secondary concern, a secondary target, a line item. She put the file down. She breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth. The archivist's instinct. Handle carefully, handle carefully. The material is irreplaceable. Scarlett, Cass's voice from the server station. She turned. Cass was looking at the screen with an expression she hadn't seen on her before, carefully controlled and failing at it. There's a second index, she said, a secondary archive layer, password protected separately from the main system. She looked up. The password prompt is your mother's name. Scarlett crossed to the server. Typed, Eleni. The second index opened. It took her 40 seconds to understand what she was looking at. Another 40 to make sure she was reading it correctly, that her exhaustion and the fluorescent light and the accumulated weight of the past 2 weeks wasn't distorting something simple into something catastrophic. It was not distortion. The secondary archive contained a second set of financial records, not Laurent's, not the network's operational history. These were records of the Moretti Legacy Trust itself. Transactions, account movements, structural changes made after Roman Moretti's disappearance. The trust had been modified. 11 years ago, the biometric access protocol had been amended. Not replaced, amended. A secondary authorization layer added, requiring not just Moretti bloodline verification, but a co-signatory confirmation from a designated trust representative. The designated trust representative, according to the amendment documentation, was a law firm in Chicago. The law firm's founding partner was listed by name. She read the name. She read it again. She looked up at Luca. He was standing just inside the vault doorway, and the look on his face, the specific quality of stillness, too complete, the kind that was not the absence of emotion but the maximum containment of it, told her that he was not surprised. The sound she made was not a word. It was something that lived before words. "You knew," she said. "Serafina, the amendment, the co-signatory requirement." Her voice was coming from somewhere very controlled and very cold. Someone had to authorize the amendment to the trust protocol. Someone was standing inside the network. Someone your grandfather trusted. She held the document up. "This signature." Luca was quiet. "It's your signature," she said. The vault was silent except for the server's hum and her own breathing. "It's not what you think," he said. "Let me explain. Is that your signature on this document or not?" A beat. "Yes." "Did you authorize the amendment to the biometric access protocol 11 years ago?" "Yes, but did that amendment create the co-signatory requirement that Damon Cross, that the Laurent proxy you let walk into my life, was positioned to fulfill?" The silence stretched. "It was supposed to be a protective measure," Luca said. "The amendment was designed to prevent forced access, to require a second authorization so that your blood alone couldn't be used against your will. A safeguard. A safeguard that you authorized without telling me, without telling anyone in this room." She set the document down on the table because her hands needed to be empty. "Who approached you about the amendment?" "A lawyer. Someone I'd worked with for years, someone I trusted." "Someone Laurent bought." Luca's jaw moved. "I didn't know that until 4 years ago." 4 years ago. The number landed in the room and changed everything in it. "You've known for 4 years that the protective amendment you added to my grandfather's trust was compromised by Laurent, that it created a legal mechanism for a Laurent proxy to claim co-signatory rights over my inheritance." She moved toward him and he held his ground, and she stopped 2 feet from him. "And you didn't tell me. You found me. You brought me here. You spent 2 weeks educating me, and you still didn't tell me. Because I didn't know how to tell you without losing you. You don't have me." The words came out quiet and absolute. "You never had me. I was a charge you were protecting. And protecting me apparently means deciding what I get to know about my own life. If you surface in Chicago and attempt to access the offshore assets, Laurent's legal team will trigger the co-signatory requirement immediately. They will argue that under the trust amendment, Damon Cross, as your legal spouse and the registered co-signatory, has a right to participate in the access authorization." He held her gaze. "That was the trap. That was always the trap. It was never just about killing you. Laurent needed you alive and married to the co-signatory to execute a legitimate-looking transfer." She heard it. She heard the architecture of it, the patience of it, the years of it. And she understood that she had not been too paranoid in Zurich, and she had not been too suspicious of Luca, and she had not been wrong about any of it. She had not been wrong enough. "Damon filed the legal claim this morning," she said. "Yes." "Which means Laurent knows I'm back in the country. Or suspects it. The filing is preemptive. It establishes the co-signatory right in anticipation of your surfacing. So every move I make now, every attempt to access the assets or invoke inheritance rights will be legally challenged through the co-signatory mechanism. Until Damon withdraws the claim or the marriage is formally dissolved, Laurent has a legal foothold." Luca looked at the document on the table. "The amendment I authorized, thinking it was protection. It is the primary weapon being used against you. I know what that means. I am not asking you to set it aside." She turned away from him. She looked at the server, the files, 30 years of evidence that she now couldn't leverage cleanly because the legal architecture around her access had been compromised at the root. From the doorway, Renaud said, "We need to move. We've been in here 22 minutes." Cass was already copying files to an encrypted drive, her movements quick and efficient. She hadn't said anything during the exchange. Now she said, without looking up, "There's a way through this." "Tell me," Scarlett said. "The co-signatory requirement is a trust amendment. Amendments can be challenged. If we can prove that the amendment was executed under fraudulent conditions, that the lawyer who approached Luca was working on behalf of a party with criminal interest in the trust, we can petition for the amendment to be voided." She pulled the drive from the server. "This archive has the evidence. Laurent's financial relationship with the lawyer who drafted the amendment is in the transaction records. If we can get this to the right federal hands before Laurent's legal team moves formally." "Before they move formally," Scarlett said. "How long do we have?" Damon's filing was this morning. A formal co-signatory claim under trust law requires 30 days' notice to the primary beneficiary before it can be acted upon. But Laurent can compress that timeline by... Cass stopped. Renaud said sharply from the doorway, "We have a problem." The sound came from the corridor outside. Not voices, not footsteps. A sound she'd never heard before but understood immediately. The specific mechanical sequence of a door being opened with a card reader. The maintenance corridor entrance 40 meters back. Then voices. At least 3, speaking low. Cass killed the server display in one motion. Renaud stepped back into the vault and pushed the door to, not closed, not fully. The lock mechanism needed to be operated from the panel, and operating it would make sound. He left it 3 inches open and put his back to the wall beside it. The corridor lights stayed on. No way to kill them from inside. Scarlett stood in the vault, in the low LED light, with her grandfather's evidence in a drive in Cass's hand, and Luca 2 feet behind her and the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside, and she measured the distance to the door and the time it would take, and the probability of getting through the maintenance corridor and up the stairs before... The footsteps stopped. A voice, outside, very close to the vault door. "The panel's been activated, recent." A second voice. "She's here." A third, quieter than both. "Mr. Laurent said bring her in undamaged. Let's not complicate the evening." Renaud looked at Luca. Luca looked at Scarlett. Cass had her hand inside her jacket. 3 of them, at minimum, between the vault and the exit. Renaud's people at the corridor entrance were either down or had missed the approach entirely. The vault had no secondary exit. She'd read the schematics and there was no secondary exit. She looked at the 3-inch gap in the vault door and the slice of corridor light coming through it, and she thought about her mother's name in a bureaucratic authorization, and she thought about the word secondary, and she thought about Luca's signature on a document that had turned her grandfather's protection into a noose. She thought about all of it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stepped to the vault door, pushed it open, and walked. She walked out of the vault and into the corridor lights, and she did it with her hands visible, and her spine straight, and her face arranged in the expression she'd been practicing for 31 years without knowing what she was practicing for. The expression that said, "I am exactly where I intended to be." There were 4 of them, not 3. The 4th was standing back near the maintenance corridor entrance, watching the approach. All 4 were professionals. She could read that in the way they held themselves, the specific economy of movement that belonged to men who spent their working lives in situations where the wrong motion got someone killed. Dark clothing, no visible weapons, but that meant nothing. The nearest one was 6 feet away when she stepped through the vault door, and he stopped moving because she had moved first, and the initiative, however slim, belonged to the person who moved first. "Miss Moretti," the nearest man said. He was mid-40s, square-jawed, with the flat voice of someone accustomed to conversations that only went one direction. "Mr. Laurent would like to speak with you." "I know," she said. That stopped him for a beat. Just a beat. These were not men who showed much, but she caught it. "Then you understand there's no reason for this to be difficult." "I understand that's what you were told to say." She kept her eyes on him and her hands still at her sides, and every nerve in her body was tracking the other 3. Their positions, their attention, where it was pointed, and what it would take to redirect it. "Call Laurent." "Ma'am, call him, right now. I want to speak to him directly before I take another step." The man hesitated. Behind her she could hear the complete silence of the vault, Renaud not moving, Cass not moving, Luca holding whatever he was holding. The drive was in Cass's jacket. That was the only thing that mattered. Everything else was negotiable. The man pulled a phone from his jacket and made a call. 3 seconds. "She's asking to speak directly." A pause. "Yes." He held the phone out to her. She took it. "Miss Moretti?" The voice on the other end was older, measured, with the particular quality of a man who had spent 68 years being the most patient person in every room. "I've been looking forward to this for a long time." "Victor Laurent," she said. "You sound like your grandfather." He had that same quality in his voice, like he was already 3 moves ahead and mildly bored by your current one. A pause. Are you 3 moves ahead, Miss Moretti? I'm in your vault with your men in the corridor and a drive full of evidence that puts you in a federal holding facility for the rest of your life, she said. You tell me. A short silence, then something that was almost a laugh. The drive is interesting, but you can't use it without surfacing your legal claim, and you can't surface your legal claim without triggering the co-signatory requirement, which means the drive is leverage without a mechanism. Another pause. Unless you found a way around the amendment, which I suspect you haven't, given that you've had, 4 hours back in the city. Her chest was very still. She breathed into it. What do you want? She said. What I've always wanted, a conversation, a civilized one, in a room that isn't a basement. His voice was calm the way deep water is calm, surface stillness over pressure. Come to the Caldwell, room 41, top floor. Bring whoever you need to feel safe. I'll have my people stand down in the corridor. A beat. You have the drive. I have your husband. I think we both have things the other needs. The line went dead. She held the phone for 2 seconds, then she turned and handed it back to the man in front of her. He's calling off the corridor, she said. The man's phone buzzed. He checked it, looked at her with something that wasn't quite respect but was adjacent to it, and stepped aside. She walked back into the vault. No, Luca said, before she'd finished explaining. Absolutely not. He has Damon. Damon Cross tried to have you killed. I know what Damon did. Her voice was flat and precise. If Laurent has him, he also has whatever Damon knows, which includes the existence of this archive, the maintenance corridor, the corporate cover. Laurent doesn't have the access protocol, but he has enough to file legal challenges that tie up this evidence for years while he burns everything else down. She looked at Cass. How long to get the drive contents to a federal contact? Minimum 12 hours. I need to verify the contact is clean. Laurent has purchased law enforcement reach, and I'm not handing this to someone compromised. Cass was already checking the drive. 12 hours minimum. Probably 18. Then I need to keep Laurent occupied for 18 hours. She looked at Luca. That's what the meeting is. It's a trap. Everything is a trap. She picked up her coat from the table. The vault was a trap. The trust amendment was a trap. My marriage was a trap. The difference is that this time I'm walking in knowing it. She turned to Renaud. I need you and Sue to find Damon. Laurent said he has him. Find where. Don't move until I tell you. Renaud nodded once, already reaching for his phone. Cass, she said, via the federal contact. Start the verification now. Don't wait. Already started. She looked at Luca last. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when the containment was at maximum. The absolute stillness that she now understood was not coldness, but something closer to grief. The expression of a man watching consequences he'd set in motion years ago arrive at their destination. I'm not asking your permission, she said. I know, but I need you there. A beat. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not quite, but the specific quality of being needed in a way that cost something. Yes, he said. They left the vault. She sealed it behind her with her hand on the panel and the deadbolts engaging in sequence, and she walked out of the maintenance corridor and up 2 flights of stairs and out into Chicago, where the night was cold and the city was lit up like it always was, indifferent and enormous, and full of people who had no idea that under their feet a woman had just agreed to walk into the most dangerous room of her life. The Caldwell was the kind of hotel that had been powerful for so long it no longer needed to advertise the fact. 40 floors of pre-war stone on Michigan Avenue, the lobby all dark marble and brass fittings, and the particular hush of extreme wealth, the sound of money that had been in place long enough to mistake itself for architecture. Room 41 was the penthouse floor. The elevator opened directly into a private foyer, cream walls, a single painting, 2 men flanking the inner door who looked at Scarlett and Luca and Cass with the flat professional assessment she was getting used to. They were relieved of their phones. Cass's jacket was examined, but the drive, nested against the lining in a hidden panel she'd sewn herself, was not found. The inner room was large and quietly lit. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the north side, Chicago spread below in every direction, the lake invisible in the dark but present. You could feel it, the enormous cold weight of it at the city's eastern edge. Victor Laurent was standing at the windows when they entered. He was smaller than she'd expected. That was the first thing. 68 years old, silver-haired, with the careful posture of a man who had worked on it. Not natural elegance, but constructed, maintained. His suit was dark and perfectly fitted. His face was the face of someone who had been handsome 20 years ago and was now something else, sharper, more deliberate. The features settled into the expression of a man who had gotten most of what he wanted and was accustomed to getting the rest. He turned from the window when they came in. His eyes went to her and stayed there. "You look like Eleni," he said. The name in his mouth was the most violent thing she'd experienced all night. She did not show it. "Don't," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then, with the unhurried movement of a man who controlled the pace of everything around him, he gestured to the seating area and said, "Sit down." She didn't. Neither did Luca. Neither did Cass. Victor Laurent looked at them for a moment, then sat down himself, crossing one leg over the other, entirely at ease with the fact that 3 people who wanted him in prison were standing in his hotel room, choosing not to sit. He poured himself water from the carafe on the table. "Damon," Scarlett said. "He's here, in the building." Victor took a sip of the water. "He's fine. A little the worse for the last 48 hours, but fine." "What do you want from this meeting?" "What I've wanted for 11 years. He set the glass down. "A conversation about practical realities. Specifically, you have evidence, and I have legal mechanisms that make that evidence difficult to deploy. You have bloodline access to assets, and I have a legal claim through your co-signatory that complicates that access. Neither of us can move cleanly." He looked at her with the measured calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times. "So I want to propose a resolution." "A resolution," she said. "The offshore assets. 2.3 billion, currently frozen." He tilted his head slightly. "I want access to the Moretti holdings in South America. Specifically, the 3 accounts totaling approximately 600 million that relate to the 1991 expansion your grandfather made into territory that was, at the time, jointly developed with the Laurent operation. Territory your father stole through the federal operation he engineered." "Territory in dispute," Victor said mildly. "The Laurent family's legal position is that our investment in that expansion entitles us to a claim. I'm not interested in arguing the history. I'm interested in a number." He held her gaze. 600 million. You retain the remaining assets, full control of the Moretti Trust, and in exchange the co-signatory amendment is voluntarily withdrawn and my legal team stands down. The Nero Vault archive," he paused, "stays buried." Silence. She looked at him. She looked at the careful face and the constructed posture and the glass of water and the 68 years of patience that had arranged her mother's murder in bureaucratic language and then waited 11 years to position a man in her bed to finish the job. "No," she said. He didn't move. "Miss Moretti, you killed my mother. You killed 17 people. You used a federal operation that you paid for to destroy a family and steal an empire, and then you spent 20 years hunting the last surviving member of that family." Her voice didn't rise. She kept it level the way she kept everything level now, with the particular effort of someone who understood that losing control of her voice was the first step toward losing everything else. "You don't get 600 million. You don't get $6. You get a federal indictment, and whatever time you have left watching the Laurent name become a synonym for what it is." Victor Laurent was quiet for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his leg. He leaned forward slightly, and the quality in his eyes shifted. The patient, constructed calm giving way to something older and less maintained, something that had always been under it. "Your grandfather said something similar to me," he said, "in 1993, in a room not unlike this one. A beat. He was also very certain of his position. He was betrayed by someone he trusted," she said. "I don't have that problem." Something moved in Luca's posture behind her. She felt it without seeing it. "Bring Damon," Victor said, without raising his voice. A door to the left opened. Damon Cross walked through it, and he looked the way she had never seen him look in 8 years of marriage. Diminished, The careful professional architecture of him collapsed, his shirt untucked and his face carrying the specific hollow quality of a man who had been through fear and come out the other side into something worse. He stopped when he saw her. He said her name. Not Scarlett. Not the name she'd given him. The other one. Serafina. It was the first time she'd heard him say it. In 8 years, he had used the name Scarlet Veil 6,000 times, 10,000 times, every morning and every evening and across dinner tables and in the dark, and in the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a shared life. And he had known, the whole time he was saying it, that it was not her name. He had known from the first day. He had built a life with her using a name that was an erasure, and now he stood in a hotel room looking at her across 8 years of that erasure and said the real name out loud for the first time. She didn't feel anything she expected to feel. "Sit down, Damon," Victor said. Damon didn't sit. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not guilt, or not only guilt, something more complicated and more desperate. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before this goes any further." "Damon!" Victor's voice had a warning in it. "I'm telling her." Damon's voice cracked on the last word. He didn't look at Victor. He looked at Scarlett with the face of a man who had been making calculations for 11 years and had finally arrived at one he couldn't live with. "The contract, the original assassination contract. I need you to know." "I know," she said. He stopped. "I know you signed it," she said. "I know the date. I know it was scheduled for the night after the merger announcement." She held his gaze. "I know everything, Damon. That's what the vault is for." The color in his face did something complicated. "Then you know I stopped it." The room was very quiet. "What?" she said. 3 weeks ago, He stopped, pressed his mouth closed, started again. The merger timeline moved up. Laurent moved the contract date forward 6 weeks ahead of schedule. His jaw worked. "I called it off. I told them it was logistically premature. Bought time." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was maybe the most honest thing she'd ever seen from him, which was not saying much, which she knew, but which was also real. "I told myself it was tactical. I told myself I was managing the timeline, but you couldn't do it," she said. Silence. "No," he said. "I couldn't." "That's very touching," Victor said from the chair, with the voice of a man who had stopped finding human sentiment interesting 20 years ago. "It changes nothing about the co-signatory position." "Actually," Damon said, and his voice changed. The hollow quality replaced by something that had some structure in it, the lawyer's voice. The voice she'd heard across boardrooms and dinner parties. The competence that had always been the most real thing about him. "It does." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I filed a withdrawal of the co-signatory claim at 8 this morning," he said, "before your people picked me up." He held the document out, not to Victor, to Scarlett. "The filing is already in the Cook County system. The claim is withdrawn. The co-signatory requirement in the trust amendment has no active claimant." Victor Laurent stood up. "Damon." His voice had dropped to something without warmth, without patience, the voice from underneath everything else. "Think about what you're doing." "I already did," Damon said, "last night, while your people were explaining to me what would happen to me if I didn't cooperate." He looked at Victor with the expression of a man who had crossed a line and was standing on the other side of it taking inventory of what he'd left behind. "I cooperated with you for 11 years. I did what you asked. I told myself it was business, told myself she'd be fine, told myself 100 things that I—" He stopped, swallowed. "It doesn't matter. The claim is withdrawn." Scarlett took the document from his hand. She looked at it. Cook County Civil Filing Header, timestamp from 8:14 that morning, the withdrawal language clean and unambiguous. She looked at Cass, who was already reading over her shoulder, and Cass gave a single short nod. Victor Laurent crossed the room in 4 steps and hit Damon across the face with an open hand. The sound of it was flat and hard in the quiet room. Damon's head snapped to the side, his shoulder catching the doorframe, and he went down to one knee. The 2 men who'd been flanking the inner door moved forward. Luca moved faster. What happened in the next 11 seconds was not elegant. It was not the choreography of action films. It was the ugly, brutal arithmetic of two trained men in a small space with furniture in the way. Luca taking the first man down with a force that used the man's own forward momentum, the second man pulling something from his jacket, and Cass intersecting before it came level, the sound of something hitting the floor and someone hitting the wall and a chair going over. Scarlett did not move. She stood in the middle of the room with the withdrawal document in her hand, and she watched Victor Laurent, and Victor Laurent watched her. And between them was 11 years and a dead mother and a burning house, and 2.3 billion frozen dollars, and 30 years of evidence in a drive in Cass's jacket lining. And she held his gaze, and she did not look away. "It's over," she said. "Nothing is over," he said. His voice was still controlled. The composure was remarkable. She'd give him that. He was standing in a room where his operation had just come apart, and his voice was still level. "You have a drive. You have a withdrawal document. You still need a federal contact who isn't compromised. You still need a jurisdiction. You still need time. And I have lawyers who can generate filings faster than you can move." He looked at her. "You're 24 hours away from anything concrete. A lot can happen in 24 hours. "Yes," she said. "It can." Her phone was in the Caldwell's foyer with the rest of the confiscated electronics. What was not confiscated was the backup. A second device. Small, the kind sold at convenience stores, that Sue had put in her coat pocket in the Pilsen brownstone, and that she'd kept there through the vault and through the drive and through this conversation. She had not used it yet because she hadn't needed it yet. And she'd learned something in the past 2 weeks about the difference between having a card and playing it. She needed it now. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the phone and called the only number stored in it. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice. "This is SSA Brennan." "This is Serafina Moretti," she said, looking at Victor Laurent's face while she said it, watching the composure fracture at the edges, watching the patience give way for the first time to something human and afraid. "I have a complete evidence archive documenting Victor Laurent's coordination with federal officials in the 1994 Moretti operation, 30 years of transaction records, and a current location." She paused. "I also have Victor Laurent in the room with me. Room 41, the Caldwell Hotel on Michigan Avenue." Another pause. "How fast can you move?" Victor Laurent's face had gone the color of old ash. 30 minutes, SSA Brennan said. "I'll keep him here," Scarlett said, and put the phone in her pocket. The room was very quiet. Victor looked at her and she looked at him, and between them something passed that had no name. The specific recognition between two people who have been on opposite sides of the same story for a long time and have arrived, finally, at the same page. "You had a federal contact," he said. "I had a federal contact," she agreed. "How long?" "Cass has been building the relationship for 18 months. She held his gaze. "We were always coming back here. We just needed the evidence in hand first." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the window. Chicago below, the city lit and indifferent, and something moved through his face that she could not interpret and did not try to. Whatever a man of 68 felt standing in the room, where 40 years of careful construction finally fell apart, was not her problem to understand. "Your grandfather," he said, "would have made a deal." "My grandfather is dead," she said. "Because of you." She walked to the windows and stood with her back to him, facing Chicago, and she listened to Luca behind her securing the room, and Cass on her own phone, and Damon somewhere to her left breathing with the unsteady rhythm of a man reassessing the cost of every decision he'd made for 11 years. She watched the city, and she thought about nothing. She was very good at that now. Below, on Michigan Avenue, the first unmarked federal vehicle pulled to the curb, then a second, then two marked units, their lights off, parking along the cross street with the quiet coordination of people who had been ready for this for a long time and had been waiting for the call. Behind her, she heard Victor Laurent pick up his glass of water and set it back down. The small sound of a man with nowhere left to move, performing the last ordinary gesture available to him. "Room 41, she said, to no one in particular. "Top floor." 30 years. 30 years of evidence, waiting in a basement under the city, waiting for blood and will and the specific kind of patience that was not passivity but accumulation. The patience of someone who understood that the right moment was not found but built, constructed out of every smaller moment that came before it, the way a document is constructed, layer by layer, until the thing you've been building finally holds its own weight. The elevator in the foyer chimed. SSA Brennan was 28 minutes early. Scarlett turned from the window. Victor Laurent was looking at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years believing he was the most dangerous person in every room he entered, and who was understanding now, with the specific clarity of final things, that he had been wrong about that for a very long time. SSA. Brennan was 43, lean, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and the specific economy of movement that belonged to someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where the wrong gesture got cases thrown out. She came through the penthouse foyer with 4 agents behind her, and she read the room in approximately 4 seconds. Victor Laurent standing by the window, Luca with his hand still on the shoulder of the man whose arm he'd controlled for the last 20 minutes. Cass with a drive in her hand and her jacket torn at the collar, Damon Cross on one knee beside the overturned chair with a hand pressed to his jaw. Her eyes found Scarlett. "Miss Moretti," she said. "SSA Brennan." Scarlett crossed the room and handed her the withdrawal document, and then looked at Cass, who stepped forward and placed the encrypted drive in Brennan's other hand. 30 years of transaction records, communication logs, and documented coordination. The index is on the drive. Physical originals are in a sub-basement archive on East Wacker Drive. I'll give you the access protocol. Brennan looked at the drive for one moment. Then she looked at Victor Laurent. "Mr. Laurent," she said, "I'd like you to come with us." Victor didn't move immediately. He stood at the window with Chicago behind him, 68 years of patience and construction and violence assembled into a man in a good suit. And he looked at Scarlett one last time with the eyes she would spend a long time afterward trying to correctly classify. Not anger, not defeat exactly, something more complicated. The look of a man encountering something he should have anticipated and didn't, which perhaps in the end was the most honest thing she ever saw from him. "Counseled by your grandfather's ghost," he said. "Counseled by his documents," she said. "He was meticulous." Victor Laurent turned from the window and walked to SSA. Brennan, without being asked twice. The agents moved with him toward the foyer, and the room changed. Pressure releasing, the specific quality of air after something has broken that was too tight for too long. She let herself breathe, just once, fully, the kind of breath she'd been managing into careful quarters for 2 weeks. Her ribcage expanded and her eyes stung, and she blinked it back before it became anything visible. And then it was done, and she was standing in the Caldwell penthouse with the Chicago night behind her, and the hard part, the part that required the particular performance of being 3 moves ahead and entirely certain, was over. The part that came next was different. Damon was sitting in a chair when the agents cleared the room. He'd gotten off the floor under his own power, straightened the chair, sat in it. His jaw was darkening where Victor had hit him. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man whose accounting was not done. Scarlett pulled a chair out across from him and sat down. She didn't say anything immediately, neither did he. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary machinery. Traffic far below, the distant geometry of other lit buildings, the lake invisible and enormous. "The withdrawal," she said finally. "You filed it this morning." "Yes." "Before Laurent's people got to you." "I filed it at 8:14. His voice was flat and careful. "They picked me up at 9:40. She thought about that. About an hour and 26 minutes. About what a man does in that window when he's finally made a decision and can still feel it being the right one before the consequences arrive. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes were tired in a way that went below the surface. Not the cultivated exhaustion she'd watched him perform for years, but something actual, something that had been there maybe longer than she'd known and that she'd never been looking for. "Because I watched what I was," he said. "Not what I told myself I was, what I actually was." A pause. "What I actually did." "Damon, I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish it." His voice cracked at the start of the sentence, and he steadied it. "When Laurent first approached me, when they explained what you were, what the assets were, what I'd need to do. I told myself I'd never hurt you, that I could manage the situation, that when it came to the final decision, I'd find another way. His jaw worked. I told myself that for 11 years, and then 3 weeks ago, Laurent moved the timeline and someone put a contract document in front of me, and He stopped, started again. I approved it. I told myself it was to buy time. I told myself I'd pull it back. I sat in my office for 3 days telling myself I was managing it. He looked at her with the honesty of a man who has stopped managing anything. And then I couldn't sleep. And the next morning I filed the withdrawal. She sat with that. The room was quiet. One of Brennan's agents was still in the foyer, visible through the open door. "You approved a contract to have me killed," she said, "and then you withdrew it, and you want me to understand something about that. I don't want you to understand anything." His voice was precise on that, no self-pity in it. "I'm not asking for understanding. I'm telling you what happened because you deserve to know what actually happened, not the version that makes me less of what I am." She looked at his face, the man she'd married, the specific features she'd woken up next to for 8 years, the jaw and the eyes and the careful ambition, all of it sitting in a chair across from her wearing the evidence of the last 48 hours. And underneath it, something that might have been real somewhere in those years, something small and badly managed and ultimately not enough, but real. She thought about what it would mean to forgive him, not for his sake. As a practical matter, what it would require, what it would cost, whether the architecture of it was even structurally sound. "The claims," she said, "any other filings, any documentation you've signed related to the Laurent operation and my identity. I've been cataloging it for the federal investigators. Everything." He held her gaze. "I'm cooperating fully. No conditions. That'll put you in front of a grand jury." "Yes." "And probably cost you your license." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "When did you know?" she said. "When did you know that you—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "When did what you felt about me stop being performance?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside, one of the unmarked vehicles on Michigan Avenue moved, its headlights sweeping the building face. "I don't know when it started," he said. "I know it was real. I know that doesn't change what I did." He looked at the window. "I know those two things don't resolve each other." "No," she said. "They don't." She stood up. She picked up her coat from the floor where it had fallen during the struggle, and she folded it over her arm, and she looked at Damon Cross sitting in the Caldwell penthouse chair with his darkening jaw and his accountant's soul and the specific wreckage of a man who made a final decent decision 11 years too late. "Cooperate with Brennan," she said. "All of it. Anything they ask." "I will." "And Damon." She paused at his chair. The account in the LLC, the Moretti Legacy Trust filings, the forged signature on the 2018 financial authorization. She held his gaze. "I found everything. Not so you'd know I found it, so that I knew exactly what I was dealing with before I made any decision." A beat. "I'm not pressing charges beyond what the federal investigation covers. That's not forgiveness, that's efficiency." He looked up at her. She walked to the foyer. Brennan was in the hallway outside the penthouse with 2 agents and a phone, and the particular contained energy of someone whose evening just got very complicated and very significant simultaneously. She looked up when Scarlett came out. "The archive access protocol," Brennan said. "I'll write it out for you. It's a 14-character alphanumeric plus biometric. You'll need me present for the biometric component." She paused. "Tomorrow morning. I'm not going back to that building tonight." Brennan looked at her for a moment. "Understood." A beat. "Miss Moretti, how long have you been building toward tonight?" Scarlett considered the question. 2 weeks, technically. Or 22 years, depending on where you started the count. Or from the moment a 9-year-old girl was walked out of a burning house and given a new name and told to disappear. "Long enough," she said. Brennan nodded once, respecting the boundary of it. "We'll need a full debrief, tomorrow or when you're ready." She offered a card. "I'll have someone outside your location tonight." Scarlett took the card. She looked at it. A name, a number, a federal emblem. The official language of accountability, printed on government standard cardstock. One more thing, she said. Bernard, a maintenance supervisor, Caldwell Building on Wacker. He went missing 4 days ago. Brennan wrote the name. We'll find him. He kept those records safe for 30 years. Find him first. Brennan looked up from her notepad. Something shifted in her expression. A recognition, one professional to another, of what 30 years of loyalty actually cost. First, she confirmed. The Pilsen brownstone at 2 a.m. was quiet, in the way operational spaces go quiet after the operation is done. Gear on the table, half-empty coffee cups, the particular flatness of adrenaline leaving a room. Sue was at the communication station running a final sweep. Renaud was cleaning equipment with the systematic focus of someone who needed his hands occupied. Cass was on a call in the back room, her voice too low to hear, which probably meant federal liaison work, the long, unglamorous labor of making sure the right people got the right documents in the right sequence. Luca was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked older than he'd looked 2 weeks ago, which Scarlett understood was not age, but cost. The specific way that the final accounting of a long decision shows on a person's face. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that had gone cold. He was looking at the table surface. She sat down across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. She was past the point of constructing what she felt about Luca DeSantis, past the anger, which had been real and was not done, and past the layer under the anger, which was more complicated and harder to name. The man who had walked her out of a burning house. The man who had authorized an amendment that turned her grandfather's protection into a mechanism of her own undoing, both things simultaneously, neither canceling the other, the way most true things about people refuse to resolve neatly. Bernard, she said. Brennan's looking for him. Luca looked up. Good. Did he know? About the amendment? No. Bernard knew the vault, the access protocol, the cover structure. He didn't know about the trust documents. He picked up the cold coffee and set it back down without drinking. He knew who you were. He used to ask every time I checked in, is she all right? Is she safe? His voice didn't shift, but something behind it did. Every time, for 22 years. She thought about an old man in a building basement, maintaining a dead man's evidence in silence for 30 years, asking after a girl he'd never met. The specific kind of loyalty that didn't require acknowledgement or reward, that simply persisted because some people were built that way. When this is done, she said, I want to meet him. When this is done, Luca said, I think he'd like that. She sat with the quiet for another moment. Then, the amendment, the trust modification. He didn't look away. He'd learned, or he'd always known, that looking away was the one thing that couldn't be recovered from. Yes, you were trying to protect me. I believed I was. And when you realized the lawyer was compromised, 4 years ago, you were afraid that moving on it would expose me, trigger Laurent's attention before the network was ready. Yes, a beat. That is the honest reason. There is also the reason that I was afraid of telling you what I'd done. Both things were true simultaneously. He held her gaze. I'm not offering the honest reason as mitigation. I'm offering it because you deserve the complete account. She thought about what Damon had said an hour ago in the penthouse. I'm telling you what happened because you deserve to know what actually happened, not the version that makes me less of what I am. 2 men, tonight, giving her accounts that cost them something. She was not in the habit of valuing confession as currency, but she understood it was a choice, that the version that protected themselves had been available to both of them, and they'd chosen the other thing. It didn't fix anything, but it was a data point. The network, she said. After this. The remaining structure, the people, the assets. What happens? Luca looked at her. That depends on you. Roman left the network to the bloodline. Roman left everything to the bloodline. She had been thinking about this for 3 days, in the spaces between the vault and the hotel and the federal handoff, thinking about it with the methodical precision she applied to archival decisions, working the damage assessment, determining what could be preserved and what had deteriorated past the point of saving, what the structure was actually for if you stripped away the history and the criminality and the 20-year freeze. Legitimize it, she said. He was quiet. The financial infrastructure is real. The offshore architecture, the investment holdings, the European operations, none of it needs to be what it was. She looked at him. Dissolve the criminal elements. Convert the remainder into a legitimate international investment structure. The Moretti assets, once accessed, are enough to capitalize it properly. She paused. There are 20 people in this network who have spent years maintaining something that didn't need to be criminal. It was criminal because Roman was criminal, and Roman was criminal because that was the world he built in. It doesn't have to stay what it was. Luca absorbed this. That's a multi-year restructuring. Yes. The criminal operations can't be dissolved overnight. There are relationships, obligations. I know. I've read the files. She held his gaze. I'm not saying overnight. I'm saying that's the direction. She paused. Can you do that? Can the people in this building do that? He looked at her for a long time. She watched the assessment move through him. Not of the plan, she thought, but of her. Of whether the 9-year-old girl he'd walked out of a burning house and the 31-year-old woman sitting across from him in a Pilsen kitchen at 2 a.m. had arrived at the same place. Yes, he said, then that's what we do. She stood up. She was going to sleep for approximately 10 hours, and then she was going to present herself at the federal building with an access protocol and 30 years of evidence. And the day after that, she was going to begin the process of unlocking her grandfather's frozen empire. And the month after that, she was going to file the legal restructuring that converted a criminal network into something her mother might not have been ashamed of. She was going to do all of that. But first she needed 10 hours and a room with a door that closed, because she was 31 years old and she had been running on controlled fury and archival precision for 3 weeks, and the body had its own accounting, separate from everything else, and it was coming due. She paused at the kitchen doorway. Luca, she said. He looked up. Don't make decisions for me, she said. Not again. Whatever you know, whatever you find out, whatever you're afraid I can't handle. She held his gaze. Give it to me. Let me decide what I can handle. A long moment. Yes, he said. I will. She went to bed. Bob. Bernard was found 4 days later in an Evanston apartment belonging to his daughter Petra, where he'd been sheltering since the morning he'd detected surveillance on the Wacker building and walked out through a service exit rather than risk leading anyone to the vault. He was 73 and his health was not good, and he had spent 4 days in his daughter's spare room with a burner phone and a conviction that the network would find him, or it wouldn't, that 30 years of service either meant something or it didn't. Scarlett drove to Evanston herself, with Cass in the passenger seat and Renault following in a second vehicle. She sat in Petra's small living room across from a man who was shorter than she'd expected and who looked at her for a long moment with the particular quality of someone seeing a thing they'd waited a long time to see. You look like Eleni, he said. The second person in 2 weeks to say that. The first time it had been a weapon. This time it landed differently. Not soft. Nothing was entirely soft yet, but with a quality of recognition rather than possession, like being seen rather than assessed. I've been told, she said. He studied her face. His hands, resting on his knees, were the hands of a man who had spent decades in physical work, calloused, deliberate. She was braver than people knew, he said. Eleni, people saw the softness. She wanted them to. I know, Scarlett said. I do the same thing. Something settled in his face, a decision being confirmed perhaps, or a weight being set down. I kept it safe, he said. The archive. You did. 30 years. I know. She held his gaze. I know what that cost. He looked at his hands. It wasn't a cost, he said after a moment. It was just what there was to do. He said it with the simplicity of a man who had resolved that particular question long ago and did not need it made complicated again. She sat with him for an hour. She let him tell her about the building, about the maintenance corridor, about the 2 times over 30 years when Laurent's people had come close and not close enough. She listened with the quality of attention she'd developed at the archive, complete, patient, understanding that the document in front of you contained things you hadn't known to look for until you looked. Before she left, he said, Your grandfather believed you'd come back. He couldn't have known I would. No, but he built everything as if you would. The old man looked at her. That's not nothing. She thought about Roman Moretti, whom she had never known except through documents and the second-hand accounts of people who had loved and feared and served him. A man who built a criminal empire, and a legacy of violence, and also, somewhere in the architecture of it, a vault full of evidence and a frozen inheritance and a bloodline he trusted to do something he hadn't lived to do himself. The contradiction of him was not something she could resolve into a clean assessment. She'd stopped trying. No, she said. It's not nothing. Victor Laurent's arrest was not quiet. The federal indictment dropped on a Thursday morning, and by noon the financial networks were processing the implications. Laurent Global Entertainment's stock dropped 31% in the first 2 hours of trading, recovered partially, and then collapsed again when the detailed indictment documents became public and the scope of the coordination with organized crime became clear. The charges covered 3 jurisdictions, 4 decades, and included the 1994 operation that had been officially documented as a successful federal action against the Moretti crime network. The official narrative, 30 years old, came apart in public over approximately 72 hours. Scarlett watched some of it from the Pilsen brownstone, on Sue's monitors, with the same quality of detachment she'd applied to evidence work at the archive, noting what was accurate, noting what was distorted, noting the places where the public narrative was still getting it wrong, and making a mental note to address them through the proper channels at the proper time. She had learned from her grandfather's files and from the week of her education that the record mattered, that what got officially documented was what survived, that the archivist's instinct, preserve what is true before it deteriorates, was not a professional habit, but a moral one. She released a statement through Brennan's office with a legal team she'd assembled in the first 3 days of the federal cooperation. The statement identified her as Serafina Moretti, surviving heir to the Moretti estate, and contained a single paragraph about her mother that she had written herself and would not allow the legal team to edit. Eleni Moretti was 34 years old when she died. She was a daughter, a mother, and a woman who understood that what you preserve matters as much as what you build. She did not survive to see what her father built used for what he intended it. This accounting is, in part, for her. She did not watch the coverage after the statement released. She'd said what she needed to say. What the news cycle did with it was not her responsibility. The biometric access to the offshore accounts was completed over 2 sessions, with Brennan's office present as federal observer and the Moretti estate's legal team managing the trust documentation. The co-signatory amendment was voided by court order 10 days after Damon's cooperation agreement was finalized, the fraudulent procurement of the amendment having been established through the Nero Vault records. $2.3 billion, unfrozen, compounded over 22 years into something larger than that. Scarlett did not feel what she expected to feel when the final authorization cleared and the accounts became accessible. She'd expected something, triumph maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a lock finally opening. What she felt instead was responsibility, settling onto her like the weight of a coat taken from someone else's shoulders, larger than she'd expected, not unwelcome, just real. She transferred the first tranche within 48 hours. $22 million to a Chicago-based foundation she'd incorporated the week before, focused on preserving immigrant historical records across the Midwest. It was not a strategic opening move. It was a personal one. She had spent 8 years in an archive restoring documents that told the stories of people who had been erased by circumstance and time, and she understood, without needing to articulate it, that the first thing her grandfather's money was going to do was make sure those stories didn't disappear. The second tranche funded the network's restructuring. The third went to a legal defense fund for the 17 families of the people killed in the 1994 operation. She had their names from the archive. She had read every name. She would not pretend that money repaired what had been done, but she would not pretend the obligation didn't exist. 8 months later, on a morning in early November when the first real cold had come into Chicago and the trees along the lakefront had given up the last of their leaves, Scarlett Vale, Serafina Moretti, returned to the Harmon Historical Archive on South Michigan Avenue. She had not been inside since the night she left through the service entrance with Cass and the black SUVs and the door locking behind her like a sentence ending. The building had been undergoing renovation for the past 4 months, funded through the Moretti Foundation. The work of expanding the archive's capacity and digitizing 50 years of backlogged immigration records that had been deteriorating in storage for lack of resources. She let herself in with the director's key she'd been given when the foundation began funding the work. The front gallery was empty this early, the renovation crew not due until 8. She walked through the familiar space, the smell of old paper and preservation chemical, the particular quality of light through high windows, the sense of accumulated time that gathered in places where documents were kept. In the main gallery, a temporary display had been installed as part of the renovation project, artifact cases showing the history of the archive itself, from its founding in the 1930s through its various expansions and the communities whose records it held. One of the cases near the back held a small collection of items that had been donated to the Foundation's founding collection, objects with historical significance to the project's origins. She had asked for this, specifically, and she had explained why, and the archive's director had understood. Inside the case, under clean glass, on a small display stand, was a receipt, cream paper, silver embossed logo, faded ink, transfer amounts in neat columns, and at the bottom, handwritten in blue ballpoint, the line that had woken her up. Once the wife is removed, the merger proceeds. She stood in front of the case for a while, alone in the empty archive, with the November light coming through the high windows and the smell of old paper around her, and the particular quality of a morning that didn't require her to be anyone except the person she actually was. She thought about her mother, who had understood that what you preserve matters. She thought about her grandfather, who had built everything as if she would come back. She thought about Luca, who had made the worst decision of his professional life trying to protect a girl he'd walked out of a burning house, and who had spent the last 8 months making good on the promise he'd made in a Pilsen kitchen at 2 a.m. She thought about Bernard, who was 73 and not well, and who had said it wasn't a cost, it was just what there was to do, and who came to lunch at the Foundation's offices on the second Friday of every month because Scarlett had asked him to, and because he seemed, improbably, to like the sandwiches. She thought about Damon, who was cooperating with 4 federal investigations and had lost his license and was living in a smaller apartment in a different part of the city, and who had sent her a single message, 3 months ago, that said only, "I hope you're well." She had not responded. She did not know if she would. That particular accounting was not closed. Behind her, the archive door opened. Footsteps she recognized. Cass, who had an early meeting with the Foundation's legal team, and had texted 20 minutes ago to say she was parking. "You're here early," Cass said. "Couldn't sleep." Cass came to stand beside her, looking at the display case, at the receipt under glass. She'd seen it before. She'd been in the room the first time Scarlett showed it to the archive director, watching the director's face cycle through confusion and recognition as the story was explained. "You sure you don't want it somewhere more secure?" she said, for the 3rd time in 4 months. "It's in a fireproof case in a fully alarmed building." "That's not what I mean." Scarlett looked at the receipt, the faded ink, the cream paper, the evidence of a betrayal that had turned out to be an inheritance, the countdown to an execution that had become something else entirely. "I know what you mean," she said. "No, let it stay here." She looked at the handwritten line one more time. "Let people see what greed costs." Cass was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your 8:15 called ahead. They're 5 minutes out." "Right." She straightened. She turned from the case. The morning was beginning in earnest. The renovation crew's truck pulling up outside, footsteps on the front stairs, the sound of a city getting on with itself. She walked toward the front of the archive where the day was waiting, and behind her the receipt sat in its clean case under careful light, preserved the way all irreplaceable things should be. Not destroyed, not hidden, not weaponized, but held. A record of what had been done. A record of what it cost. And a record, written nowhere in the document but present in the very fact of its preservation, of who had refused to disappear. Outside, the first snow of November was beginning. Light, early, the kind that wouldn't stick yet. Just the city's reminder that the cold was coming and nothing stayed the same. Serafina Moretti stepped out of the archive into the winter morning, pulled her coat against the wind off the lake, and walked forward into the day without looking back. There was nothing left behind her that needed watching. Only the work ahead, which was enough. which was, after everything, more than enough.